Tom, I wonder if you have that. Your attack on small boats law is wrong, Archbishop. We had been trailing the fact that the Archbishop was likely to stand up in the House of Lords and make a moral case against the government's immigration policy. He did. He, unsurprisingly then, attacked it as immoral. Does he have the moral right to do that, do you think, Ayesha, as a member of the House of Lords, as a religious figure, as the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Yeah, I think he does, because I think this is sort of bigger than, partisan politics. I think this is about British values. And I think he is there as a really important symbol in, the iconography of British life. And we just saw him at the coronation, placing the crown on the King's head. He does have a view. And I feel that many Conservative MPs pick and choose who is allowed to have freedom of speech. And they have quite a sort of, kind of bipolar relationship with the House of Lords. If somebody in the House of Lords says something they don't like, suddenly the House of Lords is really bad. But they're quite happy to stuff it full of people who will be sort of kind of cronies. And I actually think we know that the King himself has expressed concerns about Rwanda. Many people in the church, there are two institutions we care about in this country, King and Church. And look, there is a problem with the small boats. There is a problem with people trafficking. But this isn't going to make things better. I mean,
Salma Shah, Robert Jenrick was doing a round of interviews yesterday, the immigration minister. On one hand, he talks about the migrants, that they're not British enough, or they don't have British values, they can't speak English. And probably the most important British person on the land, could arguably is the Archbishop of Canterbury, is coming out in defence of these migrants. It feels like the Conservative Party are really kind of off story here. They kind of, haven't really got a hold of the situation, and probably doesn't reflect what's happening, what people generally believe, and also what the Church thinks.
Look, I think there's a real difficult issue for the Conservatives in that the way that they talk about migration, unfortunately, in the polling is showing that it has some resonance. And so I think from a completely cynical political perspective, there is that sense of leaning into that, right or wrong. On the question of moral authority, the Archbishop absolutely has a right to wade into this debate. And it's not just about the religious aspect of it, but that is an important part, because when you're making political decisions, and you may disagree with me, Ayesha, but when you're making political decisions, you think about the practicalities and you think about the politics, but who brings in the moral question? And I think that's why it's important to have religious leaders, or, other leaders, you don't have to be religious to be moral, to bring in that argument. But I do think we have to recognise, and if we're going to have this debate, that a lot of people do not agree with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and perhaps he needs to sell that message, a little bit better.
And the Daily Express says on its front page, critics accused the head of the Church of England of hand-wringing and said there is nothing moral about allowing vulnerable people to be smuggled across the Channel. That's where the immorality is. Yeah, according to the Express. But and a lot of people would agree with that.
Well, look, the Express is sort of picking and choosing. The reality is, for various factors, from climate change to war, just look at what's happening in Sudan, people do want to come over to this country. And refugees, fleeing persecution, have got a right, particularly if they've got family connections, to try and come over to a destination. We take far fewer people than a lot of our European sort of counterpoints. But I think what we're seeing now is a kind of a hysterical whipping up of really extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric. And the thing that's really interesting about it is that I think everybody would agree across the political spectrum, apart from a tiny minority of people, probably on both sides of the extremes, something has got to be done. But we also want humanity, we want compassion, and we want something that's practical. The thing which is interesting, Salma, you mentioned about the, maybe this political language has got traction. I think before the local elections, I would have believed you. But for all the talk of small boats, it delivered small votes for the Conservative Party. So it's not even like this political strategy of just going really hardline, being very, very hardline about immigrants that come to this country, and, by the way, Pakistani men in this country as well. It's not actually delivering the Conservatives the votes they need.
It's interesting because, of course, the Conservative Party, and you were an advisor to a very senior Conservative cabinet minister, Conservatives insist that stopping the small boats, it's one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, it's an issue people keep talking about on the doorstep, so they presume it's a vote winner. The fact of the matter is that the cost of living overshadows everything right now, does it not?
Yeah, and I think that's true. But I think that the more people talk about the small boats issue, the more it's going to have resonance and the more people are going to be asking questions about how it's going to be fixed. So because he's made that pledge now, there's going to be no let-up on this. The question that he's got to ask himself, the Prime Minister, is he going to continue to take a very hardline approach, which lots of people do like the polling, even though it doesn't show in the local elections, it may well show in the general, and there is going to be a difficult position for Labour to take on this.
I think we sort of disrespect some of the voters. I think they see through it. Yeah. I mean, I did a documentary on immigration and race for ITV tonight. I went to Dudley, which has actually remained a Conservative council in the recent elections. And people there, they were sort of, yes, we do care about these migrants, but we also know that we're being played by the government. You know, they probably still voted for Conservatives, may whatever, but they're aware of what's going on, you know.
I think the thing is as well, because the government have made this such centre stage about... I mean, Rishi Sunak did a speech and the podium had "Stop the Boat" sort of written on it. The reality is, since all this talk of Rwanda and all this tough talking, what's happened to the numbers? They've not gone down, they've gone up.
And
the
it
reality
won't be solved
is,
before
absolutely,
election. Yeah.
And I think they've ended up and I've actually had Conservative MPs tell me this, that what they're worried is that they've created such an expectation that they're somehow going to drop the numbers of votes. It's not going to happen. And that's going to cause more dissatisfaction. Like, the truth is, whoever was in power, whether it's the Conservatives, it may well be Labour at the next general election, is going to have there's not an easy fix on this, but making these kind of false promises and demonising all migrants and creating a kind of climate of fear, that's not solving things.
Just a very quick thing. It's really interesting that we have, I think, at least 26 bishops in the House of Lords. The only other country in the world that has religious clerics who have a voting position is Iran. Is Iran. I mean, that is remarkable.
Well, I mean, a whole other conversation about this is the House of Lords and whether there should be some...
That is quite something, though, isn't it?
Well, that is. But it's not the size of the House of Lords as well. I mean, it's just absolutely ballooned.
But also, I think it's important to point out the very soft Anglican Church is very different to the way that the Iranian clerics...
It's a religious doctrine, and it's religion having an influence on law and on order.
Yeah, but we do have an established church that is constitutionally connected. I mean, we saw that again just at the coronation, to go back to Ayesha's point. You know, it is not disconnected. We are in a Christian country, you know, from a constitutional perspective, but I don't think that's ever stopped diversity of view, diversity of faith, and I think that is something that should be applauded.
And also, I think a lot of our faith leaders, and actually I think the new king is very good on this, they're very keen on kind of building interfaith community relations, because that's how you get strong communities, where sadly some of our political leaders right now seem to have a very different agenda and they want to sow division rather than trying to bring people together.
Meanwhile, today we are expecting that the base rate, interest rate, may rise from 4.25% to 4.5%. It doesn't seem to let up, Salma, the economic pain for people.
And I think the difficulty here is the way that the government sort of described another one of its pledges, which is cutting inflation. You know, that's not true, because you can't
halving inflation. That's the aim, isn't it?
But you can't actually do that, because inflation's going to keep growing. All you can do is stop the pace of inflation rising. And so I think there has to be some reality checking about actually what's going to happen to costs and what the government's then going to do when it comes back to energy price subsidies and when it comes to things like support in the benefit system as well for those people who are most vulnerable. So I don't think these questions that arose at the last budget have gone away.
I read in the Times this morning that more than half of those aged 24 or under in England and Wales still live at home, according to newly released census figures, with many too poor to strike out on their own. 51.2% of 20 to 24-year-olds still live with their parents, up from 44% 10 years earlier. I'll be really glad if my kids stay at home until they're 24. I'm not sure that they'd want to, though.
I was going to say, maybe they should take on the British Asian model. We never leave home. You're not allowed to leave home. What? You're leaving home? Are you mad?
But it's a sign...
Go to your room.
Exactly,
and do your homework.
I'm 43 and got 2 kids. I don't care.
And you're not sharing a room with your wife either.
Exactly. God, it's like we live in the same house, actually.
Well, do you know what? I mean, that looks like the model that we're moving towards. More than a quarter of all adults aged under 30 still living at home. But the fact of the matter, it's not comedy, is it? It's tragedy because these young people can't afford to get their own places. How do they get a deposit to get their own place or pay rent?
I think this cost of living crisis and these really punishing times, I think we don't quite appreciate the profound effect it's having, particularly on the younger generation. Like, our generation, you know, we had a completely, I'm probably a bit older than you, but like, you know, had a completely different experience. And I think it's something that we're not going to realise until quite a bit of time in the future. The idea that as a young person, you come out of university, you start your adult life saddled with debt. You can't even rent a room, you know, unless it's like a king. And that really changes your life experience in terms of standing on your own 2 feet, you know, becoming an adult, you know, experiences the good and the bad of sort of young adult life. It's completely changing, I think, the life experience for a lot of people.
Well, you know, if you get to sort of 30s, 40s, it's very hard then to buy a property. You know, it's really difficult. And I was in Spain recently speaking to some people there, my friends' children. They don't buy. I mean, it's a whole rental market. I think now a lot of young people are just going to end up renting for the rest of their lives because it's going to be very difficult for them to even get onto the property ladder.
So this is one of my pet issues. I mean, pet issue, but I used to work on housing policy in government, and one of the things that I just do not understand is why housing supply is going down. And if the government wants to make an important intervention, and this is, you know, a decades-long problem, we just can't get the housing supply into the market, then, you know, we are going to, I think, lose a generation because it's not like the European model where there's lots of great places to rent. I mean, anybody who's renting at the moment will tell you the stories of people being hiked on the rents and the prices, having really poor quality properties. And this is in the private rental sector. This is not
So why is housing supply low then?
And this is a huge, complicated question. This is around planning. This is around demand. So you talk about not having money for deposits. That's one of the critical reasons because cost of living in many places is high. Therefore, being able to save for a deposit becomes really difficult. And so unless you've got the bank of mum and dad, you're not getting on the property ladder.
But just because often we hear about migrants saying, oh, there's not enough room, there's no room to build new homes, we're running out of space. Do you think that's true?
No, there are so many planning permissions. I mean, if you go through the numbers of kind of like how many planning permissions are waiting to be built on, actually there are loads of housing there, housing opportunity there. So you've got to be able to unlock that pipeline. But the thing is, people want to criticise property developers and all that kind of stuff and say, oh, well, you're trying to make profit. Well, that's what they're supposed to do. Sure. The problem that we have is unlocking that finance piece. How do you get people to get the deposit to help them get finance?
Ayesha, this does come back then to the immigration issue, doesn't it? Because people have young people cannot find housing. And then they might think there's too many people wanting too few houses.
I totally get that. And that is an argument that progressive people should lean into. One of the issues that sours the immigration debate is a practical, factual reality, which is a lack of resources. But you solve that by investing more. And it's not just with housing, it's with school infrastructure, GPs, you know, NHS, all of that kind of thing. But going back to the housing thing, I think one of the things that is a big problem for the Conservatives, and I've had some younger Conservatives speak to me about this, which is sometimes this NIMBYism, which you get in very strong Tory heartlands, where they're like, we don't want to build anymore because we have these beautiful constituencies and we know that our cities are growing outwards. This not in my backyard thing is a really big problem. And I think
that's not just a Conservative one.
I think the thing for Conservatives is if they want to kind of promote the idea of capitalism, young people need capital. And the problem is there's a whole generation of people who've got... They're never going to own a house. That is capital in itself, in the sense they don't feel they have a stake in anything. So why would they ever turn to the Conservative Party?
All right, we'll leave it there for now.